Despite all the struggles due to the rising cases of COVID, China on Monday announced that starting January 8, 2023, travelers will no longer need to quarantine upon arrival on the mainland. The forthcoming shift follows an abrupt relaxation this month in domestic COVID controls. The changes end the bulk of the most restrictive measures that China had imposed for nearly 3 years under its zero COVID policy. China borders have been largely shut since 2020 when COVID cases were first detected in the country. Since March 2020, travelers to the mainland have had to quarantine, typically at a designated hotel and for 14 days. That isolation period subsequently began to increase to 21 days or more for some travelers, before China began cutting quarantine times this summer. The current quarantine policy for international arrivals requires 5 days of quarantine at a centralized facility followed by 3 days at home. China's National Health Commission also said in a statement that China's management of COVID-19 will also be downgraded to the less strict Category B from the current top-level Category A as the disease has become less virulent and will gradually evolve into a common respiratory infection. It is to be noted that experts have claimed a worse COVID scenario in the country right now, while China has been constantly reporting less number of infections and zero COVID-related deaths in the country. The country's health commission also added that the authorities would stop tracking close contacts of COVID patients, halt the designation of COVID risk areas, and cancel COVID measures that had slowed the imports of goods. The commission said that the travelers to China would only need to show a negative virus test from within the last 48 hours and wouldn't have to apply for a clear health code anymore. While on the flight, passengers would need to still wear a face mask, the announcement said. Chinese citizens' ability to travel overseas will be resumed in an orderly manner, the announcement added. During the pandemic, Beijing prevented Chinese citizens from getting passports or leaving the country unless they had a clear, typically business purpose. Previously, Chinese tourists and their spending overseas, especially for luxury goods, had been a significant source of income for businesses in many international tourist spots. If an outbreak becomes severe, the institution will adopt so-called closed management to prevent the spread of infections, the authority said. China will also further increase the vaccination rate among the elderly and promote second doses among people at high risk of severe illness. China is the last major country to move towards treating COVID as endemic. Hospitals and crematoriums across the country have been overflowing with COVID patients and victims, while the NHC on Sunday announced that it would stop publishing daily nationwide infection and death stats. That decision followed concerns that the country's wave of infections is not being accurately reflected in the official statistics. Beijing has admitted the scale of the outbreak has become impossible to track following the end of mandatory mass testing.